It's really cool to be here with everyone today. My name is Pen-Yuan Hsing. You can just call me Pen. It's much easier to remember. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol right now. A lot of my research is on how people conduct research and also on open research. But that's enough about me. I am the guest host for the UKRN webinar today, the UK Reproducibility Network. Again, it's really cool to see everyone. And I'm really excited today to have what looks to be an amazing lineup of 3 different speakers who will tell us about lay summaries of research and an additional really interesting perspective on the possible role of generative artificial intelligence in this space. I think, just from my little bit of experience, I've done quite a bit of science outreach and public engagement in the past. That's my limited experience with coming up with lay summaries. I'm really curious about other ways it can take form, what its multitude of meanings are, and why they are so important. As for the AI part, it is such a huge buzzword at the moment, and I think there is a lot of different opinions on what might be a very often misunderstood issue. So I think our excellent speakers today, at least some of them, will hopefully clarify some of those issues for us. And again, bring that perspective to what it means for lay summaries. So this is the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And just really quickly, the way it's going to work is that in a few minutes, I will introduce our first speaker, followed by the next 2. Each of them will get about 25 minutes to share with us what they do. This will be followed by a brief break of approximately 5 minutes. And then for the last half hour of today's webinar, we will use that as a space to ask all of our questions for our 3 speakers today. So questions come at the end after all of our 3 speakers have given us their presentations. So that's the structure of our gathering today. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Do let us know if you have any questions. And if not, I will go ahead and introduce our first amazing guest speaker of the day, Dr. Anja Harrison, who is currently the CEO of the Collaborative Library. So Anja is also the program lead of applied neuroscience at King's College London, a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and like I said, the CEO of the Collaborative Library. Her background and research training are at the interface of psychology and biology. She comes to us with a PhD in psychoneuroimmunology from the Institute of Neuroimmunology and Multiple Sclerosis at the University of Medical Center, Hamburg-Eppendorf. This was followed by postdoctoral research at the Health Psychology Department at King's College London and a lectureship in health psychology at the University of Central Lancashire. She returned to work as a lecturer at King's College London in 2021, and Anja is passionate about empowering students, fostering interdisciplinary collaboration and public engagement. Her main career interest right now is to leverage her passion for interdisciplinary research, teaching, and mentoring to attract, excite, and train the next generation of scientists and professionals. So with that short introduction, I am going to hand the virtual microphone to Anja, who will be telling us about her work.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So if someone could let me know if you can see it, that would be very helpful. Is that looking good?
We can indeed.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That's fabulous. Okay. I mean, we're all here because we know that summaries of research articles for lay or non-expert audiences can really improve the research process. And this includes many benefits, some of which I'll touch upon in today's presentation a bit. To give you a bit of background and context, which Pen has already kind of slightly alluded to by saying I'm the CEO of the Collaborative Library when I'm not being in my day job at King's College London. I have a background in quite interdisciplinary research, which you would have heard from that sort of short intro bit, and also education research. Together with my husband, Anthony, who used to also previously work in academia and is now a clinician, we've come across the same issues time and time again, but from slightly different angles, because we've obviously got the research background, the education background, but we've also worked with a lot of experts by experience, service users. And the issues can kind of be neatly summarized by these questions here. Effectively, we have come across the fact that many people find it really difficult to get access to research, find time to read it, or understand what they are actually reading in the first place. And the issue is often that time is really scarce. And you can see this little comic strip on the left-hand side, which was kindly developed by one of our working group members by the name of Tim. I think researchers really need to think about getting across their message in a way that can be heard and can be heard quickly, because we don't really have the time to do it. We also know that researchers need to generate impact to push their research excellence framework submissions, and we know that there's a really clear lack of inclusive and authentic assessment in many programs that offer students to choose coursework formats and go beyond just producing work for the sake of passing a module. As you already said, this is something that I'm very passionate about, having been a student and thinking about these things myself a while back. I think inherently it's linked to the next issue, which is around making sure that student efforts to create and staff efforts to grade and check assessments do not go to waste, but instead can help build CVs, while at the same time also helping us break down that barrier that we're talking about. So accessing science globally should be something that we can just do by leveraging the processes that are already in place, if you ask me. And I think open access is also a key factor in this. And as we know, there is a lot of positive movement in this area, but only because of something being downloadable doesn't necessarily mean that everyone finds it very accessible at the same time. And this goes for everyone. So it's not just the public that we're talking about when we think about lay summaries and the use of it, but also scientists from across different disciplines can find it fantastically helpful to get lay summaries. Like, I speak from experience here because I have studied psychology and then entered a very psychoneuroimmunology wet lab background. So I could have definitely used lay summaries on all the background back in those days, I believe. And I think the other thing that we need to acknowledge here is that the sheer amount of research being published really means that we need to find more efficient ways of communicating the results. There are lots of publications trying to help us manage the overwhelming amount of research that is being published. You can find some of the links to relevant articles here below. It is a real problem. It is becoming almost like a burden of knowledge, because there is so much research being produced every day that it's impossible, even if you try, to stay on top of things. So what we believe at the Collaborative Library is that the key part of this, bridging the gap between sort of what's being done in research, the ivory tower, if you will, and application and understanding and making this information accessible, are vetted lay summaries of published articles. And we think it also needs to be free for everyone to access. So lay summaries were only included in about 1% of journal articles as of 2017, which is wild to think, because already in 2014 there were task forces established to say that of clinical trials, every trial needs to be technically having a lay summary attached to it, but it's not really happening just yet. And also, and this is an interesting one too, I think, that when they are actually made available, they aren't always as accessible as they should be. There's a growing amount of evidence showing that they're not very understandable to the lay person still. I also think that we can leverage creativity to make it a bit more appealing. Most of the time, lay summaries come in a written format, which is great, but it's maybe not the whole story. We could also think about videos. We could think about audio podcast type of lay summaries to make it really, truly accessible, and also, quite frankly, a bit more interesting and exciting for people to look at research, which can be arguably sometimes perceived as quite dry. So what we aim to do is we aim to team up with different types of organizations to help break down the barriers. So the idea is, you can see here, so we're involving universities, healthcare trusts, specialist societies, and charities. And what we want to do is basically break down the barriers by including students in the creation of lay summaries effectively. And the more universities we manage to entice, the more human-generated lay summary content we will have. This is an example of what we could do at King's, if King's were committing to having each student do one lay summary a year. That's what we could do, which is quite an exciting feat. But let's have a bit of a think about what advantages human-generated lay summaries have as opposed to AI creation. And there is quite a few. You will be probably chuckling that I have actually double-checked what ChatGPT has to say on this topic as well. It has offered me some ideas, but it hasn't come up with as many as I am going to present to you now. So, which is hopefully interesting in its own right. I think the first thing is that we need to think about is context and nuance. I mean, if a person actually generates a lay summary, they can capture the intricate nuances of complex topics where AI may struggle to accurately understand the context and implications of certain information. So what we don't want to do is create lay summaries that are misleading or incomplete. We also have a higher chance potentially of being able to tailor our communications, so the language and the content of the lay summaries to very specific audiences, and taking into account factors like educational background, cultural sensitivity, and individual preferences, which is obviously very important if we're thinking about making sure that these are as inclusive and accessible as they can be made. Obviously, the customization also ensures that better engagement and comprehension can be achieved amongst the very diverse audiences that we do have. The next point is creativity and interpretation. We know that AI could do some of that, but obviously bringing a bit of a human touch to creativity and interpretation to the table can be quite exciting. We can extract the most relevant and interesting aspects of a topic and enhancing sort of the readability and the impact by making sure that we highlight takeaways in a way that really works. And not to forget also about ethical considerations. So sometimes AI generated content to this date at least can lack ethical sensitivity, so promoting biases, or maybe there might be use of insensitive language, which is something that we need to be really aware of if we're making available those lay summaries to the wider public. We don't want to be using language that could be perceived as offensive. Also, human-generated summaries can ensure that the content is presented in a really respectful and considerate manner, and obviously adhering to the clear ethical standards that we set in this given context. We can also reduce complexity by breaking down ideas in simpler terms without oversimplifying them, so we can kind of like tailor it and make it really neat. I think this skill is particularly important for subjects that have really profound implications, where potentially oversimplification might lead to misunderstanding. So there's a bit of that sort of accountability effect that we need to think about. The quality control is something that we really need to think about too, because as we know in research, there's a lot of focus on peer review, reviewing content, and making sure thereby that the quality of what is being produced and being disseminated is good. And I think the same goes for lay summary content. So review processes that can ensure accuracy, coherence, and overall quality can be embedded in this. And this is obviously essential to prevent inaccuracies and misinformation, where we know these days there is a lot of that already out there. So that will give us a certain leverage over this element back. Engagement and empathy is the next point that I want to raise. Obviously, we can infuse lay summaries with empathy and make the content more relatable and also emotionally engaging, because obviously we need to make sure that the recipient understands the importance of the topic that we are talking about. I think this is particularly crucial where the content of lay summaries impacts people's lives directly, and that could be medical related information, but it could also be legal information depending on what kind of topic area the lay summary is linked up to. I think also some topics require subjective judgments or opinions that might not be that appropriate for AI generation. I mean, obviously humans can navigate the gray areas, if you will, and provide hopefully a well-rounded perspective to these things. And what we can also do is make sure that human summarizers can adapt quickly to new information. As we know, large language models tend to operate on a basis of whatever happened before that cutoff date of information that was fed into it. So new information, emerging trends, or shift in understanding can hopefully be addressed appropriately by humans. AI may struggle to keep up with rapidly evolving fields or sudden changes in context, at least to date, and from the understanding that I have, but Avon may correct me later. Also, there's a bit of a question around the content, whether it is perceived as trustworthy and credible if it was generated by a machine ultimately. There is some interesting information available around how audiences tend to be a bit more skeptical about AI generated summaries to date, and especially if they're not really aware of how the AI tool that was used to generate this really is operating and what its potential limitations are. And obviously, we can also make sure that summaries can establish a personal connection with the audience, knowing that obviously fellow human has carefully crafted a summary can enhance trust and engagement with the materials. And I think it's probably worth tempering all of this a little bit, and because obviously we know that all humans can also break those rules. But unlike AI, they can also be held accountable, especially if the lay summary publication is facilitated by a platform like, for instance, the Collaborative Library or other platforms where it's linked to profiles and people can be traced back. I think also these points may be valid, but the research available suggests that going forward, many of these issues will probably be addressable by AI, because obviously the field is rapidly evolving. The coherence and accuracy of artificial intelligence language models must be validated before they can be used for the purpose of creating lay summaries without restrictions. And we also need to think about establishing, well, quite frankly, norms and laws for AI truthfulness in that context, right? Because that requires quite significant work. So identifying what is truthful, so making sure that AI generates information that is actually based on the truth, and then creating institutions that can judge adherence to those standards in the first place, and then obviously developing AI systems that are robustly truthful on the basis of those things that we have identified, which is something that we wouldn't necessarily have to do if we were relying more on human generated content. There are 2 points though, because we've kind of said, well, this might be achievable by AI at some point, but what we can't do by AI is actually these 2 points that I would like to really emphasize, and these are my 2 last points that I want to make before we discuss later, which is the first one is that generating lay summaries the way we suggest to do it is a learning journey, and that allows learning and growth. So the process of having a person, a human, summarize allows individuals to engage so deeply with material that personal learning and growth is promoted. I mean, ultimately, like, we don't want to end the human era here and replace everything with AI, because ultimately what we're relying on for research and all these other things to go ahead in the future is also people kind of like still doing it, right? So we're thinking about the future generations of scientists, the future generations to come, that need to obviously have a very clear idea of these things. And this benefit is just not present if we're relying solely on AI-generated content. And by operating a platform, or platforms like the Collaborative, for instance, we can really create a community-driven repository, which is, I think, quite an interesting tool to have, because everyone can get access to content and give feedback to update content. So quite a flexible and dynamic network. And a community-driven platform allows for a diverse range of perspectives and ideas to be shared, and that should hopefully foster rich and dynamic environments for collaboration and innovation going forward, which is also something that we couldn't do if we just sort of like deposited all that information in an automatically generated library. So I think, in a nutshell, whilst AI can obviously be quite an efficient process and disseminate complex scientific data, I think the human touch in creating lay summaries brings that unique perspective that hopefully will increase engagement and promote learning. And I think it's about getting us all, really, quite frankly, getting a deeper understanding of the scientific process. And through the lens of the human experience and storytelling, which we can all use, we can create an environment where individuals can actively participate and build a society that doesn't just sort of comprehend the scientific advancement, but also embrace it in a wider sense. Obviously, we need to be a bit realistic here. Rather than being all or nothing and saying we just want human generated content, there may also be scope for sort of an AI and human interaction with trying to help us create this content in the future, also in the context of assessments and learning. And I think optimizing human participation without sort of the cyborg extension of tightly regulated AI promises, I think we need to really think about the risks of AI venturing out on its own. Yeah, that's as much as I have to say on this topic. So thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to hopefully having a good discussion later. And I'm going to hand over to, I think, Avon next, who I think will tell us a bit more about the AI side of things. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you so much, Anja. That was so interesting to me, and it's inspiring to see, the work that you do. Okay, so as you just said, I'm going to hand it over to our next speaker, who is Avon Huxor. So we're also really lucky to have Avon with us today because Avon has had an interest in artificial intelligence since the 1980s, when they worked on expert systems, followed by a PhD, during which Avon argued that AI can be seen as a form of medium. I'm really curious about what that might mean. During the AI winter, according to Avon, he moved into an old passion, which is astronomy, and then retrained to become an observational astronomer as well. I love that point. I love astronomy. Just a little personal take on that. And more recently, though, because how data-driven modern astronomy is, it led Avon back to AI and machine learning. And now he is a lecturer and mentor at the University of Exeter, leading an apprenticeship program in data science with a focus on machine learning. That all sounds really exciting. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Avon.
Oh, thank you, Pen. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, well, I'll just start, seeing as time short. Luckily, Anja's covered some of the things I was going to start with, so that makes life a bit easier. So a quick overview, really, of what I was going to cover. So initially, I'm just going to do a quick discussion about, what the key elements of automated text summarization are, why we do it, and how it kind of has been done historically. And then, and I hope I've read the audience right here, is that I was going to do just a very brief look at the underlying sort of technology, particularly of things like ChatGPT eventually, you know, how these kind of new techniques actually work. And it partly relates to things that Anja was saying, is that there is a risk, because I'm quite critical of AI myself, and there's a tendency for the people to kind of treat it as a bit like magic, and sort of sparkle dust that you can throw over things. And if you have a sort of vague idea of just what's really under the bonnet, it sort of just makes it a bit, I think, a bit less intimidating, and we can kind of talk about it more rationally. But I'm hoping to spend the last half of the time, so 10, 15 minutes, actually taking up the challenge that Anja made there of, you know, just what can things like ChatGPT, and in particular ChatGPT, do for us. So this, I could be very brief actually, because Anja did a very good sort of starting intro on why do it, and why text summarization, even before we get to automating it. Of course, the main problem is just the sheer volume of material published. My interest, having worked in sciences all my life, is in the sciences, and summaries make this more kind of available to, as Anja said, not just the lay people, but again, I've worked across disciplines, science and astrophysics and so on, and it's been very often it's very difficult to get into a new area, you know, without having these kind of sort of introductory ways of doing so. I suppose the argument I would then make from my side, being from the computer science department, is that even there's such a volume now that even with creating lay summaries, there's just too many documents that needs lay summaries to be able to do it all by hand. Otherwise, we just have everyone be doing just doing that. And the final thing, of course, is it's not just about science. There are sort of non-science publishing, such as news, where again there's such a flood, as we know, a lot of it garbage at the moment, which needs summarizing for everyone as well. And why particular lay summarizing? I won't go into this because again, Anja's given a beautiful kind of introduction into that. For people involved in the computing side of it, it does present these specific challenges. You know, it is that idea of getting background information, which may not be intrinsic in the document. It's just somehow in the context, as was said. Clarification of terminology and the use of simple sentence structures, which again may not be inherent in the original document. And these are kind of, you know, a real challenge for lay text summarizing rather than just general text summarizing. And by general text summarizing, I kind of mean the thing, you know, when we write a journal paper, we then write an abstract, but we do it in the same kind of style effectively as the main paper, but it just summarizes the primary findings and methods. Okay, just quickly want to cover the people who work in the automated text summarizing. There's a number of kind of a sort of taxonomy really of things that are worth considering. So I've given there's some references actually I'll kind of give on the final slide for those that are interested. So Quadrero gives a very extensive and very quite technical summary actually of this automated text summarizing, and there are a number of axes at which we can consider, you know, how the automated summarizing is going to work. So there's a type of summary, and so the first one is quite key really. It's sort of extractive, abstractive, or the hybrid, and I'll kind of go into that in a minute on the next slide. There's the type of content that you want to be summarized. So is it generic, i.e. are you summarizing the whole paper, or is it what's normally called query based, i.e. the person you're summarizing it for, or the audience you're summarizing it for, have a particular interest in a sort of large paper, and you want to kind of just summarize elements focused on that part, yeah, of the document. And finally, there's the number of documents. There's a kind of almost assumption that a summary is of a single document, but of course it needn't be. You can summarize a group of documents that are kind of related in some way. The last two, the reason I mention them here actually will come when we talk about GPT. I'll kind of come back to those, so please bear them in mind. So let's talk briefly about this extractive versus abstractive. So the old approach to text summarizing, long before the AI people kind of got their hands on it, was what is known as extractive. And it's actually quite simple, well, relatively simple. So if you imagine the source text, there's got a number of sentences in it. When you put it through an extractive summarizer, what you're doing is is basically returning in the summary complete sentences from the source, that as they were, the sentences are unchanged. And there are various techniques to identify which sentences that should be. Yeah. And that goes back into I think probably the 50s, the earliest. What people now tend to think of course, is what's known as abstractive summaries, where you generate completely new sentences that summarize the content of the source text. Unsurprisingly, there is also a hybrid, where you take a very large document, you then use an extractive summarizer to get an intermediate summary with a number of sentences taken from it, and then you do an abstractive summarizer to get an abstract, so a summary that actually has new sentences. And Winzelberger et al. Has basically suggested that for kind of lay summary generation, this kind of approach seems to be the most effective and successful. I'll kind of mention it again, actually, because I don't know if my cursor is visible, but you sort of notice that almost all the papers I'm referring to in this summary talk are actually from this year. I think there might be one from the end of last year. And this is such a fast-moving area, and it's quite topical in that there's an awful lot happening in the last 12 months. Right, so this, I was a bit wary about writing this bit. I was going to do, because I'm a bit unsure about you know, what kind of an audience you are. I imagine it's kind of broad. But I sort of felt it kind of important to talk a little bit about what really happens underneath some of these, especially the contemporary approaches, but without any equations or anything. In other words, for a lay audience. So bear with me. So the first thing we have to consider is that we want our computers work with numbers. So how can they turn all these documents and everything into something that they can handle? The kind of usual analogy we use for this kind of thinking is if you look at the kind of screen that you're looking at the moment, where you've got sort of pixels showing all the different colors that make up the images of the screen you're looking at now, my slide and my face in the corner or whatever, is that there's basically a whole range of colors, but these can all be described as the sum of the red, green and blue colors. Yeah. And so what we can do is for each and every color that we can perceive, we can just attribute 3 digits to them, 3 numbers. It's the ratio of the red, green, and blue. Yeah, so you can just see how that the kind of whole visual experience can be summed up in a series of numbers. And effectively, that's kind of what we try to do with words. So to give a very, very simple example here, if we just take the series of words I've got in the table here, so man, woman, boy, girl, king, queen, prince, princess. In the same ways we can decompose a color into these 3 axes of red, green, blue, we can say, well, we can take these words and then in a rather kind of trivial, simple-minded way, just say there are kind of 3 categories of which they are either end of on the whole. Yeah. And then we can plot them in a 3D space. So we've got age, gender, and royalty. And so when we plot it on a 3D plot, you can see that these kind of individual objects, words, kind of fit, in this kind of space of numbers. Clearly, you're not going to have to do an awful lot with just those in terms of understanding. But so, because that was done by hand by somebody. But if you've got tens of thousands of words, which you have in the kind of English lexicon, creating the axes, i.e. the kind of labels for the various things like age, gender, royalty, and then assigning kind of numbers to them so that they all kind of fit right, would effectively be impossible. But one of the kind of things that machine learning languages do is that we can kind of, by using the way that words kind of fit together in documents, is automatically learn those, both the features, which are the axes, and also the values. So basically we ask it to reproduce itself. So the way it's done, you can take a load of documents, you take some words out, and then you ask the network to predict what words is taken out. And initially it gets it wrong, and it goes around and around, changing the numbers in the network until it gets roughly the right answer. And when it's done that, you end up with something that we tend to basically call a word embedding. So here you see, for a certain set of words here, uncle, boy, he, aunt, girl, and she, it's kind of, the system has been asked to derive 300 axes. So you couldn't even look at it visually. There's 300 of the axes and assign numbers to them. And we see that one of these axes, the 126th, that's been sort of pulled out and amplified, seems to be related to gender, in that the kind of stronger numbers are particularly for he, but also boy and uncle. And then the kind of negatives are the kind of bluey colors here are for sort of feminine words. So there's so the computer's created the feature, but we can interpret it normally, or many of them, in human terms. Others, it just seems arbitrary. They're somehow implicit in the nature of the way language is structured. And it's this kind of set of structures of words and as numbers that we actually then work with. So you might say, well, how do we go from that kind of an idea to creating a way of summarizing? Well, a popular approach until very recently, until ChatGPT effectively, has been to, so we take, how do I describe it? So basically we train the system with pairs. So we get human written, it's a human written document here. So this is from CNN on the left-hand side of that panel. And then there's a human handwritten summary on the right-hand side. Yeah. And we take that, like thousands of these kind of documents or pairings of documents, and we can use it to train another machine learning system. Yeah. So what we do is we put in these pairs of systems. So we've got the text and we've got the summary, and then we have n of them. So we typically you'd have many thousands of these to make it work properly. And these are, I mean, when I say text one, these aren't the kind of letters we're used to looking at. What you put in here is all those numbers that I talked about earlier, these kind of word embeddings. And what the system does is, in a very similar way to the way it creates the word embeddings, it just sort of like finds a way to kind of create the right summary from the document, is we get a kind of a sort of a language model, a summarizing model. So it's specifically designed to summarize a text to get a summary. And if it's trained well and it's working well, what we then do is we take that completed model, we can put in a new text that has not been seen before by the system, and it will basically produce a summary as a consequence of everything that's kind of been learnt from all the training set, all these many thousands where there are summaries given. So that's kind of fine tuning based on, you take the language, you take all the kind of vector data we've got from the word embeddings, and then you can fine tune it to do a particular task. The big buzz at the moment, so I'm going to get on quickly to it, of course, is ChatGPT, which takes a slightly different approach. Although we're not quite sure what, because the problem with ChatGPT is that it's not very, even though it's created by a company called OpenAI, it's not very open. So we don't know exactly what's going on there. But what they do is that they've got this kind of initial large set of language in sort of these number form. They then take different prompts, so these like questions from many that they have. A human being answers it in some way, gives a proper answer, and then this is used, say, to fine-tune GPT. In fact, there's then a second step where it then basically the system then sort of is given another prompt and of a similar type, and it produces answers. And the human then ranks those and says that, well, the ones you've given me, this is the best, that's okay, but this is no good at all. This is, this is the worst. And basically what it does, it refines all the kind of weightings in the model, in the machine learning model, to get sort of better and better output. The difference between ChatGPT and similar to the previous approach, where you just train solely on some documents and their summaries, is that there's a whole load of things going on. There's all different kinds of prompts which ChatGPT can draw upon. So as well as being slightly fashionable, why look at it for this particular task? Why look at it for text summarization? Well, again, if you look, I mean, these are sort of scientific results here, but it does look as if in limited number of studies that have been done so far, that things like GPT, which is, that sits underneath ChatGPT, gives very good results. So human evaluators of different types of, so this is the top here, table 3, different types of automated text evaluators. I mean, Brio and T0 basically just do it in a slightly different way than ChatGPT or GPT-3. And you can see from the numbers here that the human evaluators think that the GPT systems did the best. And then on the bottom here from Zhang et al., again, 2023, is that not only does GPT seem to be better than other text summarizing systems, but actually when compared to freelance writers, about half of independent evaluators think that one of these GPT systems is actually better than a freelance writer. I mean, it's kind of, it's all, it's not quite there yet, but you can see it's very close. And I mean, this work was done on the system prior to its kind of improvements that have happened in the last few months. So given the time, I now want to actually look at some ChatGPT examples. There's a paper by Schmitz, looks at this, and he takes a paper, an actual paper. So it's this one here, partial oral versus intravenous antibiotic treatment of endocarditis. And he basically comes up with various comments about the quality, but I thought I'd revisit it using the latest GPT. So this is the one that you now get if you pay for premium. And for those who want to kind of explore this, you also have to add the plugin to read website addresses. And this actually is partly to address an issue that Anja mentioned, is that the current sort of GPT that we use, ChatGPT, does have a cutoff at 2021. There are rumors that very soon it will be going sort of online, which means that it sort of be live and be able to access current online material. And I think that may even be true in the US to some extent in beta testers. But this website tool allows you to actually access websites now, within GPT, in ChatGPT. So here, so that URL there, sorry, the HTTPS is actually a link to that paper. So what I've done is just a simple vanilla prompt saying summarize, and then I give the URL. So I don't have to cut and paste it in, I just send it the URL. And it outputs that kind of summary, which, having read the paper, I'm not that I'm a clinician or anything, but it seemed to do a pretty good job. And indeed, Schmitz, using the previous version, found that they all the tools he used did a pretty good job. Nothing horrendous to worry about. But what you can do, and this sort of addresses the point I think Anja was making about tailoring and customization, is that because ChatGPT was trained on various tasks, some of which we're not fully aware of, you can redesign, you can kind of change the prompt to get specific focused answers. So here I've said summarize the same paper, but I've added for a lay reader. Yeah, and it's slightly different. I mean, actually, it's not incredibly different, but it's slightly different. So it obviously has its own notion, or the model within GPT has a notion for what a lay reader is. I can force that even more. So what I've done there is I've refined the prompt further for saying summarize the paper, but for a reader with a reading age of 12, which is what I gather from a background survey is the kind of age at which a reading age of 12, rather not an age, a reading age of 12, is the kind of target often to make something considered to be lay in sort of science writing. And here you see it's much briefer, and it basically uses much simpler language, but it seems to get the point over. And again, this is another example of customization here. So here it's less to do with the style, but more on customizing for a particular interest of the reader. So here I say summarize the same paper, but with a focus on the impacts on patients. So everything I put in red font here is my kind of highlighting. The first comment I was going to make is that going back to my second or so slide, where in the taxonomy of text summarizing systems, you get, kind of general or query based. This is more like a query, and you're saying, if you've got a very large paper, I'm interested in things only about X, some smaller part of it. And you can see that it has given slightly especially compared to the previous output, is that, and again, I've highlighted patients in red, is that patients, as mentioned a number of times in the output, it does seem to be pulling out aspects of the paper that relate to the things we're interested in the focus. So, I mean, you can see where I'm getting with this here is that it's you can have specific summaries generated by specific prompts for certain types of user that you're interested in, rather than just having a general one. And that'd be very hard to do with just handwritten lay summaries, where you're trying to predict, what kind of person you might be writing for. Here you can interactively generate for specific parts of your audience. And the other thing you can do is, again, I mentioned at the beginning with the taxonomy, is you can actually say compare documents. So the first one is the one, so of these two here, where it says compare those two papers, those two URLs. The first one is the one we've been looking at, and the second one is I found was related to it. I think it cited it, so it had a similar topic. And I've actually only put part of the output here on this slide, because the first part of the output actually summarizes each of the two papers individually, and then it goes into this insights, it kind of compares them. Yeah. And that, again, is something that'll be difficult to do with lay summaries, unless you know that you want to do a meta-analysis of a particular set of papers and studies. If you just want to compare, 3 or 4 that are particularly interested in one user community or one readership, this is the sort of thing you can do here. One thing I was going to quickly note here, and again I've highlighted in red, is that it talks about the NEJM article here. And so what I've done is say, what is the citation for that study from the New England Journal of Medicine? Right, this is, again, Anja referred to this, the possible risks of these techniques and these technologies. So I said, okay, what is the citation? And we know what it should be, because it's the one I showed at the beginning. It's this Iverson et al. But if you look at what's output, it gets most of the details right of the actual title and the volume, and it gets a lot of the authors right, but it doesn't have Iverson, and it has somebody called Bungard appear out of nowhere. And this is a known problem with these kind of generative techniques, be it kind of images or text, is that because there's a sort of larger the sort of language model with all these connections in there, and it's pulling words out, is that there is a risk that you can get this kind of thing, which is conventionally called hallucination. And here I mean, it's inconvenient if you wanted to go and chase something up, you'd struggle to get the reference. But of course, there is a risk that if we talk about medical advice, it could be something really quite risky. So this is my kind of summarizing comments. So this rather limited, because this is all very new, right? It does suggest that latex summarization lies with things like ChatGPT. They do seem to be very effective on the whole and quite fast. But because of the problems of accuracy, this kind of thing I've just mentioned at the end, clearly because of the, particularly in the medical arena, which many of you are interested in, you can use it as a writing aid, basically, where you have a human always sort of checking the quality. So, I mean, you're not replacing the lay summarizer. They're using it as a tool, much as they would a spell checker and a grammar checker and, other writing aids that we all use. And indeed, this is the kind of style of writing that a lot of my colleagues now, and certainly a lot of the students use, where they use ChatGPT not to actually, despite the horror stories, create a complete answer to an essay question, but they use it as a way of exploring ideas or rewriting some of their paragraphs in a different way. And so I think, this is, at least for the short to medium term, the kind of way I suspect it will go. That said, and again, I think Anja did hint at this, is that because of the sheer amount of money going into these systems now, with there's Google and Meta and OpenAI, and the sheer number of people working on it, these kind of problems are being diminished. Yeah, they're not completely eliminated at the moment, but I've been sort of tracking GPT, in particular ChatGPT, over the past 6 to 9 months, as part of some work I was doing at Exeter, and it has improved. And funnily enough, it's also improved. I didn't mention on the slides, but Anja mentioned the problems of sensitivity and inappropriate language. Is that now it's actually quite difficult to get ChatGPT to say anything unpleasant. I had a sort of a public session on ChatGPT at university on British Science Festival days. And of course, some of the members of the public want to try and break it. And it actually found it very difficult. It just wouldn't do it. And I suppose then the final statement is based on my background of many years now of using computer tools for things, is that when these things become more available, which they're already, and more robust, is that they will actually change the way that we do all textual tasks, including summarizing. So it won't just, instead of it just replacing the kind of immediate bit, that whatever the processes we have at the moment for doing something in our professions, it will change that. And it will, I think, make it more interactive and more across documents. So we won't be sort of doing lay summaries of a study of say a clinical report. It'll be a sort of a constant set of summaries for a particular user on a particular day with a particular interest, and can include related cited documents, forward and backward citations, and so on. So it will be a sort of slightly different animal, and that's what sort of new technologies tend to do. They actually change the nature of the thing that we're automating. And those are the references, which I'm happy to send to people or send to the organisers if. Okay, that's me finished. Hope I kept reasonably to time. I forgot to set my clock going.
Okay. Oh, well, perfect timing, Avon. Actually, it's we're right on the hour. And thank you so much for sharing all of those technical insights. It was certainly very illuminating for me, and I'm sure for the rest of the audience as well. Yeah, I have so many questions about everything we've heard today already, but I'll leave some of that for those last 30 minutes at the end, because I like to introduce our third speaker for today, who is Sue Duncombe. So Sue is a patient representative working with Cancer Research UK. So Sue is an experienced patient and public involvement contributor, with much of her involvement being in cancer research. Her motivation for getting involved in this work is because her husband died of cancer in his 50s. So her patient and public involvement work over the last 8 years has been throughout the research cycle, from conceptualization to dissemination. Sue is really passionate about lay people being involved in research, as they are key stakeholders. She sees that it's really critical for research to be communicated clearly to lay audiences. If lay people become engaged, they will then be motivated to support further research. She has provided advice and feedback on writing lay summaries to a range of different academic institutions, charities, NIHR, and industry. So that's a very remarkable set of experiences and skills, and I can't wait to hear what Sue is going to share with us today. So with that said, I will hand the virtual microphone over to Sue.
Thank you, Pen. Just to check, can you see my slide okay?
You
Yes.
can indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, as Pen has said, I'm not a research expert. I'm a member of the public. And as such, I see myself as a stakeholder in research. And it's from that public viewpoint that I'm going to cover why I see lay summaries are important, what the benefits are to researchers, and some basic top tips when writing lay summaries that would appeal to people like me. I've said I'm not an expert, so I'm going to give you some background so you can understand where I'm coming from. I'm absolutely passionate about health research, and that's where my experience lies. And I recognise in this meeting, the research areas that you cover are quite wide. And as I go through my key points, I'd like you to consider whether the points that I'm making could be relevant in your area. My lay involvement in health research is as a patient and public involvement contributor. And what does that mean? Well, patient and public involvement in health research is all about doing things with people rather than to them. And to explain that further with a couple of definitions, patient participation is when people take part in research, perhaps as part of a clinical trial. Researchers are doing things to them. Engagement is about researchers communicating their work to patients and public, and that could be through a variety of different ways. And patient and public involvement is a two-way process where a layperson works with the research team, providing advice from the lay perspective, or sometimes as a co-applicant. And the majority of healthcare funders currently require patient involvement in research proposals to get funding. And as Pen said, I've had much involvement with the charity Cancer Research UK, who are the second largest funder of cancer research in the world. Only the US government spends more money. And I've also been involved with a range of academic institutions, charities, and commercial organisations. As such, I've read a lot of lay summaries and also worked on developing quite a few. And I realised from Avon's presentation that it's not only AI that can do extractive summaries. I realised some of the lay summaries that I've read when I've been on funding panels have been humans doing their own version of extractive summarising. So consequently, I'm presented with something that I really do not understand. My motivation for getting involved was my husband died of prostate cancer in his mid-50s. And like most patient and public contributors in health research, I wanted to do my small bit to make a difference. So having understood the context of where I'm coming from, let's look at why lay summaries are important. And to answer that question, I'm going to pose another question. Why bother doing research at all? For me, it's about providing an answer to a question. It's about increasing understanding. And ultimately, I believe that that increased understanding should be about improving society. This may not happen immediately, it may not be as a direct result of your work, but where will it ultimately lead? What follow-up work can be done? And for me, even with basic science research, it's important to keep an eye to the future. How could the research that you're currently conducting actually lead to improvements in society? And if you, for the time, go along with me, the research is about improving society, then the public are key stakeholders. Some of them will stand to benefit from the outcomes of your research. But there's another point about the public being stakeholders. Your research can only flourish with funding. And certainly in terms of health research outside commercial organisations, that funding has come from the public, either through taxes or through charitable donations. Because of this, I believe the public deserve to have your work clearly communicated to them in jargon-free, plain English. And if you take nothing else away from my presentation today, I'd like you to think about the public being key stakeholders. I strongly believe that the public deserve to have the opportunity to have access to research communications, but what are the benefits to you? Well, only if I understand your research can I support it. Whoever the researcher is and however important they are, I want them to put their work into a context that is relevant to me. I'm not impressed by jargon. I know that you're the expert. I need to feel that you understand what's important to me and that you bother to write it in a way that I can understand. I hope you're passionate about the field that you work in, and you've got the opportunity to develop that same passion amongst members of the public. With clear lay summaries, you can help them understand your work. And by explaining how your work is relevant to them, and how it can ultimately benefit them, you have the potential to develop emotional engagement. And following on from that emotional engagement, you can get their support. And the cycle then continues and increased. And I've seen this regularly in my interest of health research. Members of the public getting drawn into research, becoming more actively involved and supporting researchers to add value to their work. And seeing that engagement and support from members of the public can also fuel your passion further. I know that not every day in research you get results produced and it's rewarding. At times, I know that things are really slow and frustrating. And I've seen lab scientists who don't see patients explaining their work to a relevant group, answering the so what questions and describing how their lab work could ultimately lead to further work and clinical trials for improving patient outcomes. When I've spoken to those scientists afterwards, they've described how they were motivated by getting positive feedback and reminded of the purpose of their work to improve outcomes and quality of life for patients. Back to that idea of research improving society. But getting engagement can also mean that you can get support so that a message that you're trying to communicate can be amplified many times. Some of this support and amplification can get big decisions made, which certainly makes improvements in society. Back in 2015, Parliament voted in favour of introducing standard packs for cigarettes. Research had showed that the glitzy marketed versions, which existed at the time, encouraged children to start smoking, with the obvious sequelae of addiction, burden on the NHS, loss of productivity due to smoking-related illnesses, a negative impact on the economy, as well as the obvious personal impact of that addiction. This research was used to get engagement from the public to support a campaign highlighting to Parliament how important this was to the public. Without that public support, the legislation that was passed may not have ever been passed, and we may still have those glitzy marketed brands of cigarettes. Not all public engagement and support will be quite so impactful, but in health research, there are several places in the research cycle where it's vital to have a lay summary to get support. Many funding panels will have a lay member as one of the decision makers. This person isn't expected to have a science background. They may have, but it's not an expectation. Without a good lay summary, their understanding and support is going to be limited. This is going to reduce the chance of the researcher getting funding. If it's research which needs to recruit either patients or healthy volunteers or members of the public, the material needs to be available to those potential participants so they understand it, and particularly what the impact will be on them. Without this, recruitment rates will be low, and the study may not actually even complete. And when the work has been completed and has been disseminated, there should be a plan to disseminate to lay audiences as well as scientific audiences. And those members of the public who've taken any part in the research should particularly be communicated to. But it's not only in health research that public participants are needed. Perhaps people are needed to complete online questionnaires or take part in focus groups. An effective lay summary will increase recruitment and hence of your work. In terms of lay summaries, as a stakeholder, what do I want to see? And this is whether it's either human or AI generated. Consider, first of all, who your audience is. What knowledge, if any, do they have of your subject? What are their priorities? Understanding them will make your summary more relevant. Consider the following sections. Why are you doing the research? Explain the background to the problem that you're trying to solve. What's your objective? How will you do the research? And how will the results make a difference? For me, the first and last sections are absolutely critical to my understanding of why this research is important. And I was pleased to see in Avon's presentation about ChatGPT that actually one of the buttons you can press actually gives that focus on benefits for patients. But also consider what the best medium is. Anja referred to this. Is it a written article? Would an infographic be clearer? Could a video explain things simply? I've seen some really complicated scientific concepts explained well in very simple videos. If you decide that a text article is what's needed, I've made some points to follow, which will help make it clear for people like me. And again, whether it's human or AI generated, this is what's important to me. I was recently asked to present to researchers on writing lay summaries. And I was also asked to write a summary of the talk in advance. Here's a summary. I'll just give you a few seconds to read it. Well, you can stop at that point. It's not exactly engaging, is it? The title's off-putting. It's not easy to understand. And there's just a solid block of text. Whilst that was a summary, this is actually the summary that I produced. A title that's easy to understand. It's in a better format. There's more white space. And so one of my points is don't underestimate visual accessibility. It's not just about content. And in terms of format, the reason that I prefer the second format is they were the same words, but there were side headings. There were short paragraphs. The sentences were short. And if I'm reviewing a lay summary, I always actually look at long sentences and want to get them down to 20 words. And again, rather than using lengthy sentences, then bullet points can be used. And stay away from brackets unless you're describing a necessary acronym, because brackets just introduce a new idea and they complicate things for the non-expert. An article which has a good format puts me in a positive frame of mind from the outset and makes me feel that I can cope with it. And finally, a couple of tips on language. The title of the piece I showed you earlier was unintelligible. And I've seen many scientific titles in lay summaries that actually put me off before I actually read the body of the text. So give it a clear title. Write in the active voice. So rather than saying participants will be treated with, say, we will treat participants with. And it's not just technical jargon that needs simplifying. Use the simplest English words. Always explain acronyms before you use them for the first time, and consider, do you really need to use that particular acronym? Be economical with words. Don't use superfluous words. Basically, notwithstanding hitherto, I hate them. And a key top tip is work with a lay non-expert to develop your lay summary, and preferably somebody who will challenge you to make it as accessible as possible. And if it's generated by AI, then get a non-expert to review it. For me, research is where hope starts. Help me understand that hope with a clear lay summary. In this way, you're more likely to engage the public, and you're more likely to engage them, more likely to engage public stakeholders. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Sue, for sharing all of your experiences and expertise with us. I think in addition to, your presentation being a masterclass in how to write a good lay summary, I am also really inspired by your passion and why you do what you do. So thank you so much for that. Like I said earlier, before we end the webinar today, we will have about half an hour for a question and answer session with all of our amazing speakers today. But before we jump into that, as you can see in the agenda, we did build in a brief break. I think we're still doing really well on time. So, Kate, let me know what you think. I propose we just go ahead and take a break for 10 minutes until 2:30 BST in the afternoon. What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, I think that sounds good, because it gives people a good chance to refresh, a good cup of tea or coffee. So that sounds good to me.
Indeed.
Thank you also to our speakers. It's fascinating.
Yes, that's great. So for everyone who's here right now, again, we will take a break for the next 10 minutes. We will reconvene at 14:30. Again, with huge thanks to the speakers. And during this time, while you're taking your break, I encourage you to consolidate and think of the questions that you'd like to ask of all of our speakers. Feel free to put it into the chat if you want, or if you like to hold on to those questions, I think we can also just let you ask it directly, right, verbally, once we reconvene in 10 minutes. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you then. Okay, it currently reads 14:30 on my clock. I'm happy to see all of us still here, including all of our amazing speakers for today. I think what we're going to do for the remaining time is to open up the floor for questions from the audience. To start things off, maybe I will start with a question of my own, if that's okay. So this is for all three of our speakers. And the question comes from hearing from all of your talks that, hey, there might be, you know, some benefits to using automated, you know, automatically generated lay summaries of more complicated text. While, for example, you know, Anja has mentioned also some of the things that generative AI might not be able to cover, including a lot of the details, nuances, and accuracy, and so on. And in the wider, you know, context of all of these generative AI things that are happening right now, I see there's also a move towards setting up rules, regulations, and laws on, you know, how we want these things to be used, right, and how they work. Now, I realize that you might not specifically be policymakers per se, but from your perspectives with lay summaries, do you have any thoughts on if and how we might want to set up rules around how we use these generative tools? So that's my question. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that. Feel free to just go ahead.
Sorry, I've just realised I'm muted. I said I'm happy to start with it, Pen. I don't think there's a kind of a one-size-fits-all answer, really. That's the thing, is there's going to be a spectrum. And I imagine that there are certain tasks and certain types of documents where fully automated will be fine for most people. And then there will be an area where it kind of being partially automated with human editing will be necessary for others. And then there is probably some very sensitive material for particular audiences where you do need humans all the way through. I mean, the reason I say the latter is I'm thinking some years ago, in fact, I worked at Bristol, the University of Bristol, I was data scientist on something called the LADA program, which investigated sort of the factors that affected the health of people with learning disabilities. And we had as part of the process, you know, we made sure that all our documents were available in what was even more than lay, really, is something called easy read. So it was meant that the people who were a subject of our investigations, people with learning disabilities, could also participate. They could read the results, understand the kind of things that we were doing. And there was a particular sort of form of language called easy read. And there it was, you could not imagine, really, I don't think, automating that in any way. That took very careful, sensitive writing by a colleague, actually, who himself had a learning disability. So I think that, again, it's like most things in life, really. It's not, you know, it's a spectrum.
And if I may also join in, sort of from the educational perspective, if we're talking about, for instance, like having students develop lay summary content as part of assessments, then obviously, like, they shouldn't be using AI, should they? Or should they? And I think that's also something that we've discussed rather a lot recently, because obviously students are using these tools. And I think we can pretend all we like that we don't want students to engage with these things, but realistically, they are going to be a staple probably going forwards, as you were saying quite correctly, Avon. I think also like a writing aid, a tool that we will use just like, I don't know, proofreading software and these types of things. So I think we need to really think about how we can just govern the use a bit more. And I quite agree that there's certainly different levels of governance needed depending on what it's for. But I guess one of the things that and this is I've done some reading recently, and I've come across a really recent paper which I'm not going to do justice, but I have mentioned it briefly in my presentation when it comes around like truthfulness of what is being produced. I have done quite extensive tests to see if the coursework that we offer in our current programs is easily producible with ChatGTP. What turns out is ChatGTP writes in fantastically in a way that it makes you really convinced that it's real. But when you start looking into references and these types of things, they're just bogus. They don't even exist. So I think we really need to think about what the ultimate goal is, aligning with what Avon said there. I'm also aware that obviously it's a bit, because this technology has made such a quick jump. I think it will be probably that we will need to wait a little until we can really see all the ramifications and everything that we need to consider to properly regulate it going forward. But that's just my view.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, Pen, anything which has a direct potential impact on any member of the public needs a check. I mean, Avon gave one example, perhaps a sort of reasonably extreme example, but anything which I think has potential implications needs to be checked in terms of its credibility and accuracy so that people aren't in any way being misled.
Mm-hmm.
Agree.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? The impact on the wider public, that is so important. And, that's why we need to have rules that apply to the public and how they're affected. Anja's point is really interesting about, should we not, right? Let students use tools like this, because it just jogged my memory of this newspaper article that was circulating online a couple months ago. I don't know why it started circulating again, maybe in response to these AI issues, but the newspaper article was from maybe 40 years ago. And there was this editorial in a newspaper saying that we can't let students use calculators in school. They're going to stop thinking and they're going to not learn maths anymore. And they're not going to be able to do algebra. And I think, having this kind of historical view is also another interesting way of thinking about, okay, so how do we think about the role of new tools that we're developing and how we can govern their use? Okay, yeah, thank you so much for all of your answers. I have more questions, but I would love to hear more from the audience as well. Is anyone willing to share some of their questions or maybe other comments and concerns regarding everything we've heard today? Anything? I will note that there was a very helpful comment in the chat from, sorry, I might not be pronouncing this correctly, but from Celsia, who highlighted the OASIS initiative, Open Accessible Summaries in Language Sciences, which is at oasis-database.org, where they also have experience with both human and machine-generated lay summaries. So I just want to express my appreciation for that comment as well. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Feel free to, yes, please, go ahead, Cecile.
Thanks. I have quite a few, but I'll try not to monopolize. We've been talking quite a lot about the drafting of the summaries, but I'm curious about what any of our audience might think about the other end, which is the distribution to stakeholders. As Pen just said, I'm involved in the OASIS initiative, and that's broadly in the language sciences. And there we have links with professional associations, teachers associations, speech and language therapists, the people who are directly impacted and would be interested in our research. But we're always looking for kind of different ways to make links with people who would like to have access to it. So I was just curious as to if any of our panelists had any further ideas about how to distribute these summaries once we actually write them.
Yeah, if I may start, I think this is actually a crucial point, one of which is, I think, often a little bit neglected. When the first initial idea of the collaborative library, for instance, came about, I started obviously looking into it, like, is this already available and these types of things. And it turns out that there are certainly places online where lay summaries are made available, but they're so not well publicized that people don't really get access to the stuff that they potentially would be interested in. So I think part of what I think and what we think as a group on this project as well is that we really need to work on how we do this. I think social media is certainly a very important factor. I also think building a strong network with like-minded networks and professional organizations and so on and so forth is going to be quite key. So this is certainly what we're trying to do. Sounds like is also what you are trying to do to a certain degree. But I do also think that it's a little bit of word of mouth that needs to also follow with these types of initiatives. The more people are aware, the more they will talk about it. And then obviously, as you say, it sounded a bit, I'm not actually aware of exactly the type of research that is on your website predominantly, but I guess it'd be important to kind of cross boundaries a bit more in terms of who you talk to, because very often physicists and people working in medicine may not be aware of how the research could sort of influence one another's way of thinking about stuff. So I think going beyond sort of the traditional ways and the traditional outlet routes is something that's quite crucial going forward. That's what I think.
Just following from Anja's comment about those professional networks, then would it be possible to create, to have a sort of team of ambassadors from those networks who could help?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, that's a great idea. We've just, over the summer, we had a bit of a outreach campaign, and I think that's the sort of thing we need to do periodically. But yeah, you just never know whether, you're missing a trick somewhere and there's something else that you should be thinking about.
So you do have ambassadors. Great.
I suppose my comment, what it's worth, is as an academic, I mean, what has changed, and you can tell from my greying beard, I've been in academia for many years, and what has been interesting over the last decade and noteworthy is now, in project proposals, they kind of expect you to put outreach in there and get the budget and also be answerable for that budget, where you do go out. And at the Exeter, we have, various teams that we work with to go into the local community, to work with community groups. And it's kind of expected now. And the good thing is, so the REF, the Research Excellence Framework that many of us have to live towards, that is now quite a strong component, which, say, 20 years ago wasn't there at all. And so I'm optimistic that things will change, because it is now sort of expected. If we're taking, normally it is taxpayers' money for what we do, that we're expected to justify it.
Completely agree.
Indeed. Okay, great. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand using that function in Zoom, or turn on your camera and physically raise your hand so I can see it. Or if you don't want to speak, feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat as well. Okay. Yes, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. I said
recognize
I
you do
I
have a
just
few
thought I would
questions,
wait
so
for a
yeah,
moment. It's not
yeah.
to dominate.
No problem. Please go ahead.
So this is, again, a slightly different aspect. I was curious what the panel thought about how lay summaries might integrate with the general publication process. So this is the way in which we, as academics, make our research available. And at Oasis, we've really struggled with this because we don't want a kind of patchwork. We would like a systematic coverage of the research within our domain. That would be, that's what we think would be most useful to stakeholders. And so we've worked with journals to try to get them to request that their authors produce these summaries upon acceptance of their journal article. So it just becomes part and parcel of the publication process. And we've had some success with that. But yeah, again, my question is, are we missing a trick? Is there a way to kind of take this idea of producing lay summaries and integrate it into the everyday of what academics do so that it is something that just becomes routine and has a greater coverage of different areas?
I have some thoughts on this one. So I think it's a great idea to integrate it into the process. That's also what QDOS do as well, isn't it? They sort of like have the journal kind of like follow up after people have published using their outlet to then produce the lay summaries and publish them. I think whilst I think that there is certainly value in this, because obviously it automates things and makes it like an expected thing, I think we also need to remember that sometimes the people who wrote the article in the first place are not the perfect candidate for lay summarizing it necessarily, because I've done it horribly, used ref, tef, kef, all these abbreviations that no one knows what they are except the people that work in the field. So I think we need to try and sort of make sure that we hit those outlets and that we make it more of a process that is expected, but at the same time perhaps also integrate a bit of a level of involvement from real lay people that actually can give feedback on that what is being produced, because there's quite a few bit of interesting research that's recently been published on this, where they say actually the lay summaries that are out there are not often fit for purpose, and I think the main reason is that the authors may not be in the best position. So I think take it with a pinch of salt. I think it's great to have that process in place and to do that thing where we'll automatically populate this and this is going to be so straightforward. But I think we also need to be a little bit careful going forward. I do think that repositories of this kind, like the one that you're trying to build, the one that we are trying to build, is probably going to have to be a bit eclectic and wild in terms of the selection at first until it gains momentum. And then I think what we also need to do, and this is my personal view, is we need to team up. We need to make sure that work isn't duplicated and that we basically create one big network to kind of like make sure that we don't just do that thing where we are thinking, oh, we need to create this one ultimate resource, because realistically, unless you're Google or something, you're not going to very likely be able to achieve that. So I think collaborating with the right people and making sure that processes are put in place, and also like basically making people aware of the importance of these types of summaries. I think that's what's going to be key going forward.
And I'd wholly endorse Anja's comments about getting non-experts to actually look at things. And I think part of it is going sort of right back to the time of actually of getting the funding in the first place. So where I've been on funding panels, and obviously for health research, and there's been things about, and we will publish in, we will publish in the New England Journal of Medicine, we will publish in the Lancet, we will publish in all those expert journals. But actually, if it didn't mention a dissemination plan which highlights how the results would ultimately be communicated to a lay audience, then I on the funding panel would flag that to make sure it's included. But I guess that is in an area where lay people are part of the whole process. But I think anyway, using lay people. That's not a very nice word, using, is it? Working with lay people to help, because I think sometimes it is really difficult for experts, because we all have jargon. Whatever area we work in, we've got jargon that is just, and 3-letter abbreviations that are just part of standard language. And it sometimes needs somebody from outside to actually challenge it and say, what the hell does that mean? I don't understand. I've seen some lay summaries that I really cannot understand. And a colleague of mine that I work with said that she showed a lay summary to her 14-year-old son. And he said, Mum, I can read the whole lot of it. And actually, I understand most of the words, but I don't understand what it's saying. You know, reading and understanding are two different things. So I do, as you would expect, believe that actually using non-expert people, working with them, can help a lot.
I'm going to be slightly contrarian, actually, for once. I agree working with lay people and non-experts, but also a great believer of the years of working with colleagues is that I think the ability to write for the public is absolutely crucial for all of us. Yeah, the best scientists I've known are the ones that can explain it to a 5-year-old. Yeah, because they really know it. And I think, also they know why they're doing it, why it's important. And it's the classic kind of early postdoc who just strings together, bits, a bit like an extractive summary at a conference, and you probe them, and they're not quite sure. They're doing it because it's part of the proposal, but they don't know the value of it. And so I think it should be part of the training, actually, as researchers, that they should do it, actually. So I know at the moment they don't do a very good job, but I don't think we should necessarily accept that. I think it should be part of the education process for everyone in academia.
I completely agree with that as well, Avon. Completely agree with that. And actually, I do quite a lot of work as a PPI contributor in Oxford, and with some of their PhD students and postdocs, then there's actually opportunities for them to learn how to write lay summaries. Because I guess it's like anything else. It doesn't come automatically to many people. And so I completely agree. It should be part of the training.
It's before you even get to writing a lay summary. I mean, like when I was at Bristol, I did astrophysics there for a while. We'd ask students, PhD students, to go to local schools to talk about their work. And so it's even before you write it, you talk about it in a way that 7-year-olds can understand about stars and the planets. And I think it's all just what it should be about, really, rather than hiding in your little cliche.
I quite agree. I think this is exactly why we came up with the collaborative library idea, because I think a lot of the time when you look at like most universities, like they all have lay summaries already in their assessment structures anyway, kind of thing. Not necessarily just PhD level candidates, even much earlier than that. And I think that's actually something that it's a bit like with most stuff, you can't just do it once and be like, okay, yeah, I've done this once, so now I know how to do it. But you need to like come back to it, you need to develop it, and then if you then also get the additional sort of cherry on the top of potentially being able to publish what you're doing, then you're going to have a whole different appreciation of why it is you're doing it, and what it's for, and what people are going to benefit from it in the long run. So I completely agree. In fact, we're hopefully going to be able to officially launch this on my courses after I return from my maternity leave. So I think this is something that you will be able to tell, I'm quite passionate about, because I think it's so important, and it could be so easily done if we embedded it within the educational systems. So yeah.
I think particularly, I must admit, from a personal perspective, because I did astronomy for so many years, is that we know we're beholden to the taxpayer. There's no private, commercial money in it. It's just the taxpayer pays for the observatories and everything else. And we know that we have, from the very beginning, we teach out, well, when I was doing it, we taught the students and ourselves that you have to get out there and justify why you're spending $1 billion on the James Webb. And it's if it becomes just part of the job, I think, to always explain why it matters. It's really important.
Yeah, those are such great points. All of what you just said reminded me of a really interesting initiative. So there's this academic publisher called Frontiers, which some of you might know about, but they have an academic journal called Frontiers for Young Minds. I'm sharing a link to that in the chat right now. And what's interesting is that, again, right, they're making the same case as you're making. Hey, if you're a good scientist, if you really know your stuff, then you should probably be able to explain why it's important and how it works to a 5-year-old. Well, the audience for this journal are actually kids. And to Sue's point, in academic journals, typically they ask other experts in your field to peer review your paper. But in the case of this journal, it's the kids who are peer reviewers for the lay summaries that these researchers are writing. And I think, this, again, what you're saying reminded me of this journal because it seems to be an example of tying some of these concepts together. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And thank you for all of your input so far. It's fascinating. Any other questions or comments? Oh, I see there's one from Kate. Great question. I wonder how you manage that so the lay consultants are recompensed appropriately. This is such a good question, I think. And I think it ties to a question I have for Sue as well, but I would love to hear the other speakers' response as well, which is, Sue, I love your passion, and you're actually really professional, in what you do. And you're really an expert at what you're doing. And you're such a key stakeholder in the research process. But, I know as an academic, being properly recognized as an academic might be getting my name on a paper, maybe putting my name on a grant. But I feel experts like you, Sue, they should also be properly recognized for the professionalism that you bring to research. So maybe starting with you, how should we best recognize, right, and reward, the expert, work that's brought into research outside of those professional researchers and scientists?
I mean, sometimes in health research, then patient or public collaborators would actually be co-applicants on studies. So perhaps health research is further advanced. In response to the point about compensation, then again, in funding submissions for health research, then it would be expected that there would be a budget allocated to patient and public involvement. So there are standard rates that patient and public involvement contributors will be paid. It doesn't always happen, and not everybody. So from my perspective, if it's a commercial organization, I take money. If it's the NHS or charities or whatever, then I don't bother. But that should be offered, because one of the challenges also is most of the people who are involved in lay summaries and the whole collaboration with researchers are a particular demographic. So it's trying to break out of that demographic. So you're sort of classical, educated, older, white. And one of the big things in health research is to actually get more diversity of the public that are involved, so that everybody's views are represented, and it's not this small group of people, which I'm probably part of. And I think that is really important. So yeah, in health research, then there would be honoraria paid for involvement in research generally.
If I may add to that a
Yes.
little something. I mean, I completely agree. And I also, I've done research with service users and with experts by experience before I entered the more educational stream. And I always made sure that those were properly funded and actually built into the projects that I'm doing. I also did patient and public involvement events where I basically hosted people. I paid for the getting to the place, the food, coming back, and a little sort of voucher of appreciation and those types of things. But I also think that there's also different ways of compensation here, right? There's also the acknowledgement of the intellectual contribution that these people can make, which is enormous in my view. And I think if we had platforms like ours, for instance, where they can actually be an author of a lay summary and have that to their name equal to their academic counterparts or professional counterparts, then I think that is also something that people may find a positive element, because I think at the end of the day, being a co-applicant, because I for instance, I've submitted grant applications and I always had a lay person part of the research group, because I think, I mean, if we work with people with chronic health conditions, for instance, but I don't personally have that chronic health condition, like who else would I be turning to if not the person who has actually got lived experience? So I think we need to kind of like level the playing field a little bit and make sure that people can really claim the intellectual kind of contributions that they've made by making it possible for them to publish alongside academic partners.
Having ownership.
That's it.
Mm.
A very neat and quick way to say what I've said with many, many sentences there. Yes.
And actually, I mean, I think the ownership thing is really important, and just feeling that actually you are valued, if you know that you are almost a member of the research team, that you haven't got that level of expertise,
well, yes,
but you have actually got value that you can add, and you gave an example of that. And I think another point that I would make is, if you're looking for the public to get involved with your research, then make sure you know what sort of people you want. So write a role profile just as you would for anything else, to be absolutely clear that it's not just a tick box exercise and I can say that I've involved the public, that's it, tick, done. But actually you're looking for the right people with the right sort of experience, whatever that might be. So that's one of the things that to me is really important, that the public are not just seen as a tick box exercise, but actually they're worked with so that they really add value to the research, because without adding value, there's no point.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that beautiful comment, Sue. I couldn't agree more. You know, I think that's such a great point to end on. And I will also share my last observation on that point, which is, you know, we talk about non-experts and experts, you know, in the research process and how they should all be part of the team. But what I'm hearing actually is that it's not a matter of experts and non-experts. We're just experts in different things, you know. It could be a person, you know, who is an expert in bringing in that, you know, lay perspective that the researcher doesn't have, right? So we're just different kinds of experts. And I think, you know, again, this last topic we're talking about highlights how important it is for our research institutions, you know, our structural, you know, setup, right? How things work, so that it recognizes not just researchers in the lab or the field, but also everyone else involved in making it work well, right? And I think that recognition and having the correct compensation for bringing in the expertise, it's also really important for our institutions to consider. Okay, I am aware of the time. We're just past the hour. I certainly have many more questions, but I want to respect everyone's time. So just to wrap things up, I will note that Kate has shared in the chat that the next webinar for the UK Reproducibility Network is on November 16th. At 1300 UTC, so please keep an eye out for future events. And in addition to thanking all of our amazing audience today, I want to, you know, again, express my huge gratitude to our three incredible speakers who shared with us so much, you know, amazing insights and expertise today from different perspectives. So thank you so much to Sue, Avon, and Anja for sharing your valuable time with us today. And with that, I think we'll wrap up our UKRN seminar for today. Thank you so much, everyone.